Hi, welcome to AI Trust Talks. I'm your host, Emma Johnson, and I'm excited to have you here. Artificial intelligence is changing the way we live, work, and connect, but with great power comes great responsibility. That's why this podcast exists, to deep dive into the critical conversations about AI safety, ethics, and responsible use. Every episode will explore the real-world challenges and opportunities AI brings, from helping business owners and corporate leaders make better decisions, to empowering data scientists to create responsible solutions, to guiding parents on how AI impacts their children's safety. This podcast is for anyone who cares about building a future we can all trust. So whether you're here to learn, debate, or just stay ahead of the curve, I invite you to join me on this journey as we shape the future of AI together. This is AI Trust Talks, where we build trust in technology, one conversation at a time. Today's guest is Kelly Forbes, Executive Director of the AI Asia Pacific Institute, a global non-profit organisation committed to strengthening the Asia-Pacific economies by facilitating the responsible development and adoption of artificial intelligence. With her background as an international lawyer and policy advisor, Kelly is a global voice on AI governance, equity, and inclusion. Under her leadership, the Institute champions human-centric, rights-based AI that empowers people, especially in developing countries, while tackling global challenges like the digital divide, infrastructure inequality, and governance fragmentation. In today's episode, we'll explore how to build AI that communities can trust, what's needed to bridge the infrastructure gap in developing countries, the real-world benefits of AI done right, and how the Asia-Pacific region is shaping the future of global AI governance. Kelly Forbes, thank you so much for joining AI Trust Talks today. I'm so excited to have you on our podcast.
Very happy to be here.
So I want to kick off today by touching on a couple of different segments around AI and specifically the AI Asia-Pacific Institute. So you founded the AI Asia-Pacific Institute with trust and responsibility at its core. What does trustworthy AI mean to you in this regional sense?
Yeah. So I think we've been speaking about ethical AI or responsible AI, trustworthy AI for such a long time now, right? And I think at the core of it, we want to have technology that it does what it has been created to do in the right way, right? We want to avoid things going wrong, essentially, right? And so very early on, and we're talking probably before AI is what's today, right? Because so much has happened, I think, particularly in the last 2 to 3 years. Obviously, we have seen a breakthrough in generative AI. But we could see, 6, 7 years ago, the rise of use cases of negative implications of AI. And I started doing this work from Singapore, which is still one of the leading countries and when it comes to governance, right? But I could see how a lot of other countries were falling behind in the conversation and how those implications also had cross borders implications, right? So it's not just what you saw happening in Singapore in a particular country, but how the technology essentially travels and it affects other countries as well, right? So I think when it really comes down to what is trust is how do we make sure that we can build the technology and adopt in a safely way? And what does that look like depending on your context, right? Because again, I think from sector to sector, that can look very differently, right? But, and from country to country, from region to region, right? We have recently finished a study in the Pacific Islands, for example, and when you look at the state of the region, that it has its own local context, and we can't think about a copy and paste exercise in the same way that the technology will be built and deployed in the Silicon Valley and try to replicate that in a very diverse region such as Southeast Asia as well, right? So we think about what does that mean to have trust in technology, considering its specific diverse contexts and how it's going to be used, and it's a local culture and specific needs that that specific region or country really needs, right?
Mm. And how has your legal and policy background really influenced the way you've approached AI trust and governance? You're doing a lot of work with governments, aren't you?
I've always had a great interest in international law as a whole, and essentially how, I did my dissertation on how international law could be used to solve complex global challenges, right? And as I started to think about artificial intelligence, and it's, a few years ago, um, you could really see how this is an international issue, right? And how do we bring some type of international cooperation to support working on the risks and challenges that we currently have, right? It really helped me to have an understanding of how different jurisdictions approach the local regulations, local policies, and what is needed, right? Because it's not necessarily that you had to create new regulations for everything. I don't think that's still the case. A lot of countries already have specific regulations that do apply to specific uses of AI, right? Depending on what you're using for. And so it's more a matter of assessing the technology and then thinking about, with our national regulations and policies that we have in place, and as well as some type of international guidance, because I think we have this growing guidelines and frameworks that have been published by many governments and or international organizations like UNESCO, for example, right? So how are those practices aligned, I think, with the national context, and then how what do we need to change here, right? It's very much what countries like South Korea did, right? They went through basically the national regulations and policies and thought about what do we have to do here to actually adapt what we have to the context of AI, because AI does challenge, I think, a lot, as you know, Emma, in terms of what the implications and risks are to make sure that you're doing that in a responsible way, right?
Yeah. And do you see governments, what approach are they taking to regulations or guidelines? Are they looking at regulating the technology or more regulating the risks or the outcomes? What direction do you see them going in the government sectors that you've been having discussions with?
I think when we look globally, we do see a disparity, right? Because, if we look at what Europe has done, for example, right, with coming up with the AI Act and that very, I think, strict regulatory approach, right? Much of what they did with the GDPR a few years ago and how that essentially had an effect across the globe, right? So for any companies now doing business with Europe, you are now impacted by the AI Act, right? A lot of other governments are more concerned about not impacting innovation that way. So how do we think about putting certain safeguards in place, but ensuring that we are not left behind?
Yeah.
And and we know how important that conversation is now, right? We're living through a very geopolitical state, globally speaking, right now. And it is important for not only governments thinking about how do we prepare nationally for AI to adopt to support our economy going forward, because I think the reality is we do know technology is moving very fast, and some countries are ahead in terms of innovation. And we want to make sure that I think there's some equitable distribution of what we're actually going to see that looking like in the future, right? We saw, I guess, some of that with the rise of the internet. But I still believe that what we are seeing now with AI, it's certainly going to have a much larger impact. And it is the biggest invention that humanity would probably ever see. Right? I was watching. I think it was the Google guy that mentioned last week that apart from the splitting of the atom, we're probably thinking of AI as the next biggest thing that humanity has ever seen, right? Now, I don't know about that statement in specific, right? But we do know, I think now we recognize the impact that it will have in humanity and economies across the globe. And so I guess back to your question, how do governments make sure that they have the right safeguards for that, but they also enabling that to support the national goals, right?
Yeah. Balancing safety and innovation is key, but it is certainly a balancing act. So I want us to talk a bit more around kind of the trust in the digital divide, which you've kind of touched on just recently around Asia Pacific. So I think we all know that the Pacific Islands are very close to my heart, being from New Zealand and my husband from the Kingdom of Tonga. So we know that climate change is causing a big impact on the Pacific Islands. So AI specifically could make a huge impact to the developing regions like the Pacific. What are some of the right foundations that we can use or have to deepen those divides, and what's needed to ensure the trust in the AI systems in the Pacific Islands?
We still have a lot of work to do there, certainly. There will be some specifics to the Pacific Islands, probably when we think about that, but also a lot in common with a lot of other developing economies right now, right? They are in a very important, I think, stage where it needs to be thought about carefully what their strategy is and what they plan to do the next few years. I think we know that the next 3 to 5 years are going to be instrumental about how we're going to adopt the technology and what that means for the future, because we know that in many ways for the economies that can tackle the right problems using AI, they're going to be set on a different path, right? And so specifically, as we looked at the Pacific Islands, we know the biggest challenge is climate change there, right? And the islands receive a lot of support from New Zealand and from Australia. And so I think there's a lot happening in the space of thinking about what exactly is the potential for AI to support these islands with these very urgent problems, right? So we were, for example, supporting in a recent conversation with DFAT, so the from the Australian government, which they thinking about what is the work here that the Australian government can implement.
And this is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Correct, correct. And so what's the work that can be implemented here, and where does AI become very relevant, right? And we know this is an urgent request that we have there. But this is where I think AI becomes very valuable, because it has the potential to accelerate. When we think about, broadly speaking, when we think about those, United Nations sustainable goals, right? These are 17 goals that were put forward a few years ago by the United Nations, right? Such as energy, food distribution, water, not these key things that we need to really see in the world. And last year, as we were looking at the progress that has been made, I was participating in this conference from the United Nations, and we're speaking about how we are tracking across the sustainable goals. And the reality is not very well, right? We actually have very little time to accomplish all those goals. I mean, globally speaking, right?
Yeah.
We know, I think last year has been one of the hottest years in history, right? I think putting all those things together, we really look to the technology to think about, okay, given the little time we have, we know there's a lot of research happening here in this space. How can AI support us? So there's a lot of interesting use cases that are happening more and more. For example, AI is able to very good at analyzing and predicting when you have weather situations like storms or cyclones, right? And you can better prepare for that. So it's being used more to track those situations when you have deforestation, for example, where you have situations like bushfires, which we have a lot of that in Australia as well, right? How can you predict those situations much faster and be able to then mitigate, right, in a much more active way? So we're seeing more and more of those use cases. The largest issue remains for when we think specifically a place like the Pacific Islands are infrastructure, right? What do we need to actually have AI working to its full potential, right? We do need support from technology companies. We do need data centers. We do need to think about how do we enable this whole system, right? In terms of how it's going to be used. That applies to, I think, globally speaking, because we're speaking about artificial intelligence here and getting it to everyone, but we still have about 2 billion people that don't have access to the internet, right? And we can see how it's not necessarily that AI will bring the equality that we need to see. It really needs to be fostered by the right policies and thinking about the right programs that we need to have in place now so that the technology can really tap into those places, right? The other thing that we see a lot, and I think it's, you know, it goes from, we can think about remote populations, or you can think about how a company is deploying AI and bringing it to the employees, right? If I'm bringing a technology and telling you that you need to use it, but I haven't taught you anything about it and you don't know much about it, all you know, it's probably what you've seen on headlines, which tells you, hey, I heard that this thing can take my job away, which, yes, there's some relevance there, right? But there's more to it. And the same picture applies if you're trying to bring a technology to, remote islands and tell people, hey, this is going to make your life better, right? And if you're only doing that, you're actually not going to see a great implementation, right? There's this great recent study which shows us the organizations that have actually done a lot of homework upskilling and retraining the workers before introducing technology, so they know exactly what AI is, how I'm going to be using, how it's going to support me, and I need to get better at this so that someone using AI, will not take my job, right?
Yeah.
And so those studies show those organizations have done really well in comparison to the ones that didn't. The ones that didn't do that process, they actually saw a decrease in efficiency, right? Because I think there's so much around awareness and upskilling that still needs to be done,
Yeah.
right? Particularly when we talk about, remote locations where they have less access to education and the basic of infrastructure, right?
Agreed. There's such a big gap in that literacy, whether it be about data specifically or about AI as well. There's a lot of work to do in that space. So, how can we ensure that AI isn't seen as a foreign or imposed technology, but something that we can co create with local communities and really taking into consideration the local cultures and dialects and things like that?
It really comes down to involving community in that process, right? There's actually some interesting use cases coming from New Zealand that you might have seen, which is engaging, for example, the Maori community and thinking about how can AI be used to preserve culture and language, right? Which it has great potential there. They need to feel comfortable in that process, right? So it's about how do we introduce the technology in a positive way in terms of what it can do, right? And what we need to see happening, right? It almost takes me back to that story about development, right? Where if you go to, say, you approach someone at a remote island and he's just sitting by his boat, and every day he just fishes maybe twice, and then he goes home and rests and takes a nap and so on. And you tell him, hey, I have this great idea. We can bring 10 other people to work with you, and then you can fish all day, and then you're going to increase your productivity, and you're going to be very efficient. You're going to be able to sell your fish to other cities, and all of that, right? And then he turns and says, what does that get me, right? What's the end result? Well, then you're going to go rest, you're going to go home, have a nap, right? So what's in for me, right? Why am I going to do that whole process? So before I introduce the process, you have to explain what are we trying to do here? What's the objective, right? And if you're speaking, if you're speaking about the Pacific Islands, for example, you would say, look, there is a very high agenda here around climate change, right? We do have a lot of challenges that we need to solve. We do want to increase, for example, tourism industry here. There is actually, in some of those islands, there is a high rate of tourism and not many people to serve, those communities, those visitors, right? So you could, for example, implement AI that way to enrich the visitors that would come to the island, right? But again, I think you have to really work very closely to the community in that sense, and that applies.
See what they want.
Exactly.
Do they want this? And your story just totally made me think about my husband, because that's his dream, is just to go out fishing every single day and be a hunter-gatherer. But he wouldn't want 10 other people to come join him so he could do 10 times as much, right? He just wants to catch what he wants and what can feed the family type thing on that day. And that's quite often a culture thing as well. Like, you want to feed your village or feed your family, but you don't want to do 10 times more for others unless it's really around the family and the village around you.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we're sitting here in Dubai having this conversation, right? It's a completely different context, right? I mean, we know the UAE is doing so much across innovation, right? And people are prepared for it and people welcoming this. This might have, you might have a different experience in other parts of the world that you should be mindful of, right? When we speak about trustworthy AI, that will look very differently if you're speaking about, a different set of, local context. It's a bit like we saw with COVID in many ways, right? I'm from Brazil, and I remember people comparing the approach that we saw New Zealand taking, which obviously was a model to the rest of the world, right, in terms of what was done. But we're speaking about a country with 4 million people, right? And they were comparing that same approach to what we saw happening in Brazil, where we have 200 million people and a lot of them need to leave the house early to be able to have food by the end of the day, right? So if you tell them that they can't leave the house, well, that is going to be an issue, right? So then again, if have to adapt the policy, what you have to do differently, right? Than in that context.
That's a good comparison. You mentioned the UAE and what they're doing around here for when it comes to AI. They've also built solar panel farms in the Kingdom of Tonga as well. So their outreach is huge, and just huge appreciation for the impact they're also making on things like climate change when it comes to the Pacific. So what are some infrastructure gaps that you see that need to be addressed before AI? I think this is the hype that generative AI sort of brought to the table was people think it's just a product off a shelf. And when you're looking at complete transformation that will make huge differences to an organization, to a country, there's a lack of the appreciation of the infrastructure behind that that's needed. What do you think we need to do to kind of bridge those gaps?
Yeah, I like to think of them as, AI constraints, right? Because you can speak about the technology and when you actually look at the statistics at the moment, we know the technology is there available. But if you actually look at how it's actually being implemented, it's actually really small in comparison, right? And so, I believe part of that is due to when we think about AI constraints, one of them being infrastructure, which might involve even designing policies that can enable adoption, right? So, for example, we have a lot of colleagues in the institute that work a lot on the intersection of AI and energy, right? In Southeast Asia, places like the Philippines, they have a very ambitious agenda for implementing AI to support them with the energy transition that they have to make, right? But to be able to do that, a lot of the times, it's not that the technology is not there, the technology is there available, but the challenge really oftentimes comes down to, do we have the right policies here in place to actually enable this implementation? Because the old policies a lot of the times that we had wouldn't quite apply to AI now. We need to probably revise this, and that also has a lot of, I think, cultural sensitivities, right? So
Mm.
again, we're speaking about that local context of what people want to see, right?
Mm.
We worked on this specific project with ASEAN, right? And we looked across all the Southeast Asia countries, and the context is specific to generative AI, because when generative AI first came in, we realized that, some of those guidelines or frameworks that we had in place for traditional AI,
Mm.
it wouldn't quite work now. And so what countries had to do to be more prepared for that, right? And what we saw a lot of the times, it was almost, there was a lot of concern around, we don't want to see here a copy and paste exercise of Silicon Valley,
Mm.
right? We have our own values, our own religion, and we need to make sure that we are designing and deploying technology that respects that, right? So for example, now you have this interesting initiative which comes under the leadership of Singapore, under AI Singapore. They designed their own language model, which is called Sea Lion, which is now being deployed across Southeast Asia countries. They can train the model according to their own, you know, specific needs across culture, religion, and so on,
Mm.
right? So I think, yes, as we think about that context, right, of deployment, there's a lot more, I think, specifics that will go along the way to really make sure that, well, how do we do that with our own context? And that's very important because
Mm.
we don't want, a copy and paste exercise. I think particularly given the state of the world as we see with a lot of geopolitics, right? I think that what we will see more and probably are seeing more and more is, for example, Southeast Asia coming together as a region, right, to work together on those issues because they need the infrastructure around data centers, for example. And if countries don't have the necessary infrastructure, they can work with neighboring countries, right, to guide them and see how they're doing and collaborating that way. So I think we are going to see a lot more of that, which is partially because of the state in which we see the world now, where, initially for example, we know the US government was supporting a lot more of countries globally speaking, right, developing economies. And as we see that support reducing, with that, we might see some independency growing in terms of, okay, we've got to figure this out on our own now.
Mm.
We've got to actually think about what we need to have in place to make this work.
Yeah. And can you tell us a bit about the work you've been doing in New Zealand around online safety and AI?
This is a work really close to my heart. And I think to anyone that thinks about the intersection of technology and children, right, which is the next generation that is now growing up with artificial intelligence and the impact that will have, right? And so as we started to do this work, which is being in partnership with NetSafe, New Zealand agency, we really felt this is pioneering work. We have not seen many developments across that front, but we have seen, I think, a lot of examples of why that is important, right? So we think about a lot of risks from cybersecurity to just safety of children in general, right? Thinking about that globally, I think we saw again Singapore taking leadership. They've designed a specific agency to oversee specifically online safety issues, for example. I think we're seeing governments catching up on those issues, like the Australian government has just issued some new regulations around that area, right? I think really interesting again to see a country like New Zealand, which normally, I think for a small country, it's always pioneering many, many initiatives, right? And that was, I think, another one. Um, that work has now arrived at the parliament there to guide in terms of what are next steps, right, that the government should think about in terms of creating some, I think, stronger safeguards
Mm.
around the online safety that we need to see. At the same time that, AI, we saw this again with the rise of the internet, right? We didn't really know initially with the internet the risks that were going to be created, right?
Mm.
We couldn't quite foresee. We had to, sort of mitigate things along the way as they came up. And in some ways, I think AI is introducing that idea again. However, in a much more, I think, exacerbated way, right? And that is probably the danger, right?
Yeah.
Because we're really thinking about a technology here that could be used also to prevent, risks from arising, around online safety. And then I guess with the introduction of generative AI, we definitely saw again, I guess, a rise in those risks, right? And then I guess we have to think carefully about how do we apply the technology to prevent those issues rather than exacerbate, right? It's the same story, I guess, we're seeing growing around cybersecurity, right? We know that it can be misused by the wrong individuals, right? We also know that to prevent that, governments and organizations need to become very good at utilizing AI to prevent those same risks, right?
Yeah. Two sides to the coin for sure. So, what lessons do you think we've learnt around ensuring inclusion, fairness, explainability are in deployments today?
I think it's been a long road for us. All these principles that you mentioned here, they have been put forward, few years ago now. I think we're looking at, roughly, 7, 8 years ago, we started to see them as, hey, AI, it's important to have transparency. Hey, AI, it's important to be fair. We didn't really know what that means, right?
Mm.
In theory, then you had all, governments issuing these frameworks and giving you some fair idea about how to do this. But then we saw a large gap in terms of, okay, how do we actually go on a day to day and implement these ideals, right? And as we're learning, I think with the development of technology, particularly again, generative AI, is the challenge that some of those principles bring, right? And you probably see that with your work, right, Emma? And I think every organization, every government is saying that. I don't think that it's a black and white situation, but it's about what process do you have in place, what to mitigate, what people do you have in place to work with the technology and be able to detect when something does go wrong. We're also seeing, and we started seeing that with generative AI, because of the nature of being under deep learning. The fact is that a lot of the times we will not completely understand how a decision was made by a system, right? And so principles like transparency really challenges us because it's about, okay, if you're driving your car and you're about to face an accident, you can't quite explain to me why you decided to turn right or left, right? And this is almost like we're facing with the technology now, which is very, very good at solving difficult problems, but a lot of the times it won't be able to quite tell you how it made that decision.
Mm.
And in some ways, I think looking into the future, we humans need to be okay with that fact of, okay, as long as the outcome is efficient and what I would like to see, I'm okay. As long as we see so much work, I think, across the intersection of AI and biology now, for example, right? Processing of, drugs is being accelerated and all those great advancements in science, right? A lot of the times we won't be able to quite explain, but we do want the outcome, which is we're reducing diseases. We're able to come up with drug discovery a lot faster and to be able to implement those solutions, right? And and so I think there's a trade-off here, and we started to see that very clearly with generative AI. And now we have agentic AI, which is a step further where we're bringing systems and you're giving them even more autonomy. And the fact that they're autonomous really means that now we are reaching a next level of efficiency. And with that, we're also having to delegate many of the decisions that we as humans are often used to being in a loop, right? New processes are emerging to be able to correctly mitigate those issues, right? With generative AI, for example, we saw this rise of misinformation, right? Content that was being created by the technology. And we didn't really know, is it fake? Is this real, right? We saw this rising of, politicians with videos and statements that we didn't really know if this was real, right? And that is a huge concern. But then we also saw quickly research across labeling, right?
Yeah.
How we're going to mitigate and be able to, in the future, detect when something is not real, right? And I think we're seeing more of that around agentic AI as well now, right? There are ways to the technology is being researched to create, I think, safeguards as in the development process to be able to create some safety barriers as we go along the way. So there's also been a lot of, I think, technical research on that level, which is very reassuring that, yes, sometimes you can see how things could potentially get out of hand, but I think we're being able to quickly come up with new ways and new research that could support us to implement more of the technology, right? What it does on the negative side is that it would be very difficult, for example, if you're an organization and I'm introducing agentic AI and you have no idea what you can expect, what can go wrong, and all these things. And I'm just telling you, oh, it's going to be great. It's going to be all these systems working alongside each other. And we hope that they're going to figure this out, right? But if I come to you and I say, look, A, B, and C can go wrong here. However, we have these processes in place to be able to safeguard those issues, then you're going to be a lot more confident, probably, in utilizing the technology. Again, I think that goes to what we think about when we think about trustworthy AI, right?
Yeah. I think you've touched on so many points here. There's always ongoing discussions around why do we hold a machine at such a higher degree of accuracy than we would a human that was doing that job today or
Yeah.
could do more with the system, etc. So there's always that. You've touched a bit about the principle-led approach, and we know that the principles have been in place for quite a number of years and they're evolving, and we're learning more about what those principles really mean. But then you have got some organizations which are potentially going down a path of blue washing around just talking about the principles, but not getting to the meat behind it. And that's what really matters. And that's where governance comes in. And then thirdly, just the point around accountability is a really big topic. And anyone that tells me that they can't understand why accountability is not a big topic has clearly not been in this space for a while and really trying to resolve for those problems. It takes regulations, it takes governments, it takes every industry to be involved in holding the right people accountable at the right time. And then last but not least, I just think we're entering into an era of some fundamental concerns around the data, where the data is going, where it's been, how it was derived, and the new data being developed through outputs. If it is misinformation, where is it going? How far is it going? And what do we need to do to kind of bring that back in? So a lot of work to be done. A lot of work has been done. A lot more to do to kind of manage the future of where we're going. So just talking about governance and that real trust imperative, the world is waking up to the need for regulation. And so what role is Asia Pacific Institute playing in building globally harmonized but locally trusted AI frameworks?
Putting together a few bits and pieces, I guess, in terms of what we've been discussing here, right? How do we ensure that we have some type of process around developing and adopting AI responsibly, but that also respects, I guess, balances that innovation versus regulation that we need to see, right? A lot of the times, I think the word regulation might be a strong word, particularly for developing economies.
Yeah.
Because the reality is that these economies need the technology to really solve critical problems now. We don't want to over-regulate and push them even more apart, right?
Mm.
What we want to do is to create practical programs and solutions where it can foster, help them to leapfrog, right, in that direction. So on that, we've been part of an interesting initiative here happening in Dubai, right? Which looks at how do we think about data now, data protection, considering the rise of AI, right? Like you mentioned, I think this is a big issue that we see globally speaking, right? But how do we do that in a practical way? So I think, we've been working on something really interesting here out of GIFC. We also see a lot of interesting work coming from the UAE, a lot from Singapore again. I think a lot around sandboxes, right? Which is this idea of how do we bring governments and private sector together to collaborate on those issues, right? And I really see the governments that are doing well are the ones that are really able to tap into that. Because AI is something that's so new and it's just dramatically evolving constantly, it's really difficult for regulators and policymakers to keep up with the technology.
Yeah.
Unless they work very closely with technologists, right? And so it has never been this important to have that partnership, I think, public and private sector. And yes, that receives a lot of criticism as well. There's been a lot of conversations around the rise of technology power. We do know that that is a challenge to balance. But at the same time, I think governments need to be agile and think about how they can approach that in the same way, right? It will always be the case that governments will hold the pen about what needs to be regulated and what policies are here. But as they do that, they need to feel confident, right, in terms of what they're doing. And the best way to do that is working closely, right? You cannot, I think, regulate or design policies to something you don't quite understand, right? I think even internally, we have been very much taking that process, right? When you think about policies or advice or any activities that we are hosting or putting forward, we have a lot of people around us with interdisciplinary skills, right? Whether it's from technology or science that can comment on the things that we're working on, right? So you don't just have technologists talking about AI or just the policy people, but you think about how do you bring that together. And that is not always easy,
Yeah.
but it is needed.
I think collaboration is the number one thing that builds successful AI deployments, or even if it's regulations, bringing together industry, governments, various different organizations to the table to kind of draw out those discussions. One size does not fit all when it comes to AI, whether that be the actual technology or the regulations, and really having that diversity of thought and that diversity of input makes a huge game changer to when we talk about the success of AI. So, just as we kind of move on to the road ahead, and what are we seeing as some of the biggest trust risks that may come out of AI, and especially as AI becomes more agentic and embedded into critical systems? And how is that really going to impact the markets like Asia Pacific?
Our biggest challenge right now is to really think about this sort of power play that we are witnessing, right? And that was an intersection with geopolitics, right? What does that mean for regions that are caught in the middle of that, right? And AI, of course, it's being recognized as central for future power, and how do we utilize that in the right way, right? And what does that mean for those specific countries? And in the context, then again, what sectors like are really important for us here, where we need to have that technology playing, but we also they need to think about having the right safeguards and so on, right? So this year we really only just start tapping on the potential of agentic AI, and as well as the potential things that can go wrong, right? Again, I think it will be a busy next few months as we see these things on the rise in a similar way to what we saw happening with generative AI, right? And I think that's a process that we are going to have to go through. There is no other way, I think, to quite predict. But at the same time, how do we embrace the technology, right? And what brakes do we need to put in terms of advancing that, right? There's a lot of resistance because of that. But at the same time, AI is here to stay. AI is not going anywhere. If anything, right? We know that it's just going to accelerate now.
Mm.
And all I think we have to do is to educate ourselves. And that's probably, I think, the core, the foundation, I would say, as we move forward. What awareness programs, activities that we must have in place, right? Whether this is inside governments or organizations, to be able to follow the trends, but as well as picked up on this rise of potential issues that we need to work on, right?
Yeah. So, if you had one message to give to global leaders on why trust must be designed into AI systems, what would that message be?
The big picture here is that we all want this to work for all of us, right? I'm someone that has lived and worked in, over 6 countries now. Sometimes very different contexts, right? Whether I was in Asia or in Brazil or now I'm here in Dubai. But one thing that we all have in common, whether you're speaking about developing economy or not, is that we all want the basics, I guess, in terms of what life for the future should look like, right? And we want to avoid a future that does not look very bright. Even in this, I think, environment that we're currently in, where we have a lot of tension, geopolitically speaking, um, there are, I think, signs of the importance of coming together in AI and agreeing to the basics, right? Of what do we want to do with the technology, how we want to use. We have done this before, right? We have done this, with human rights in the past, right? We came together globally to agree on, hey, those things that we saw happening, with wars, those things shouldn't happen again, right? What is the minimum standard here that we should work towards, right? In an ideal scenario, we would see more of that. So thinking about how can governments work more together to be able to arrive in those outcomes from the perspective that you're going to be more successful if you're actually working with more neighbors, right?
Yeah.
Particularly for, I think, those regions that are in a very sensitive position right now.
Kelly, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on AI Trust Talks today. Thank you so much for your valuable insights, and I'm sure the audience enjoyed it just as much as I did.
Thanks so much, Emma.
That's it for today's episode of AI Trust Talks. I hope this conversation has sparked new insights and empowered you to think critically about the role of AI in our lives. Together, we have the power to shape the future where technology serves humanity responsibly and ethically. If you have found this episode valuable, don't forget to subscribe, share, and join the conversation. Your voice matters in building a trusted AI future. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and let's keep building trust in technology, one conversation at a time.